I'm back, finally. So this is the second part of project number 3, embellishing a drawstring backpack. And I do have to apologize to any of you who got kind of caught in between the two parts of this project because I was getting a daughter graduated and ramping up on my violin practice. I'm getting ready for a performance. That said, I see that we have a summer full of sewing in front of us, and I hope to put up a few more videos to get you going this summer on all of your sewing adventures. And to the ladies who are waiting for their napkin ring tutorial, I apologize, you're gonna have to wait for one more video. I really couldn't move on until I finished the second part of the third project. Today we're going to be building on concepts that you learned in prior videos, like how to construct a drawstring backpack and how to embellish that backpack with trims and lace and pockets and that type of thing. And we are now going to show you how to line that bag. And bonus, I'm going to be showing you a blind hem stitch that's by hand, and you will use this so much. This video is worth it alone just for that blind hem stitch. I can't even tell you, you are going to use that over and over and over and over again. You really need to learn how to do this stitch. On top of which, I will probably show you how to properly rip out a seam with your seam ripper. That's also worth it. I'm sure none of you will make a mistake, but I make mistakes a lot. Me and that seam ripper are very good friends. None of you all have seam ripped or will seam rip nearly as much as I have, so I feel quite confident in showing you how to use your seam ripper to your best benefit. Let's get started. Let's line a drawstring backpack. You'll recognize this ribbon trim from part 1 of project number 3, embellishing a drawstring backpack. Well, today we're going to use that piece of fabric that we embellished and make this drawstring backpack out of it. Here are some of the skills we've learned about in previous videos that we will also be using in this video. If you haven't mastered these skills, well, don't worry, we're going to practice again. But if you don't know what they are, go back to my prior videos so you can learn. To all those previous skills you've learned, we're going to add all of these new ideas today. Whether or not you've decided to embellish your drawstring bag project, you will need a front and back piece and 2 loop pieces for today's project. But you're also going to need a lining piece. You will find all of the measurements that you will need in the description of this video. Before you start this project, make sure you check the description in this video to prepare all the pieces that you're going to need. You'll need a front and back piece for your bag, as well as 2 loop pieces and a front and back piece for your lining. So remember when you're sewing a drawstring backpack, how you sew these little loops to the bottom where the drawstring goes through to make your backpack straps? Here's the loop, and here's the drawstring threaded through the loop to create a strap for your drawstring backpack. We are going to make a lining now, and really the only difference between making a lining and making the bag itself is that you will not be sewing these loops to your lining piece, just to the backpack part. Also, I feel a little bit bad about showing you this fabric because honestly, I don't want you using this fabric for this project. This is not a beginner type of fabric. It's super stretchy, as you can see, very hard to sew on, definitely more of an intermediate advanced level type of fabric. But now that I showed you it, you will want it, right? I mean, it's really kind of cool. It gives this really upscale, leathery, kind of sophisticated look. I really love it. But yeah, don't choose this fabric. Instead, I am choosing to show you this, which is really fun. That's like the Scandinavian type of looking backpack, and we're gonna line it. This is flannel, and it's much easier to sew on. Definitely more of a beginning project. This flannel, and it'll be cute too. We're gonna line it with green. Your creativity can always win. So maybe you won't have that Gucci looking backpack, but you can have this cute little Scandinavian backpack. I'm really gonna like it. I'm going to take it to all of my outdoor Pacific Northwest adventures. Even I'm a little shocked at how cute this backpack turned out. I've already been complimented multiple times carrying it around in stores. So you can see that I have already applied all this trim. It took me a long time. You have to measure and make sure you have that trim on, and I did every single piece by itself. But if you're motivated, if you want that look, you'll go to the effort. You have to do a lot of measuring. I think you can see the back, all my sewing, stitching lines. But if you think it's gonna be super cute and you're motivated, it's really worth it, and it will give you a lot of practice putting on trim. Another thing to notice about this lined backpack project compared to the regular drawstring backpack that I showed you before is that these edges are not finished off. I did not finish off the raw edge with the zigzag. And there's a reason for that. When a project is lined, it is not necessary to finish off those raw edges because they will not be showing, number one. And unless they're particularly big time fraying fabric, like maybe a raw silk or something like that, there's really no reason to finish off those raw edges, and you can just skip it. So from here on out, the rule is if you're gonna line something, you do not have to finish your raw edges. If it's not lined though, absolutely. I love lining. I love to line everything. I try to line as many things as I can line because lining is one of the most professional and beautiful ways to finish off anything. It hides all of those raw edges and just looks so beautiful and finished to line something. This is your first experience with lining. You're gonna love the result. This is gonna be so beautiful. Look how great lining looks inside of a bag. I really love this green color. It's super cute. After pinning and sewing your loops to the front piece of your bag, it's time to remember your sewing mantra, right sides together. We're going to pin the front and back pieces of your bag together after sewing the loop in preparation to sew. As a review and a reminder, you'll be putting the back and front bag pieces right sides together and pinning up both sides and the bottom, leaving the top open. Notice that your lining pieces are shorter than your bag pieces by a good 2.5 inches. Take a look on the top edge there. That's about 2.5 inches different. And that is purposeful because the bag sections will eventually be sewn down to meet the lining pieces and will create your casing. As you pin your lining sections in preparation to sew, one thing I forgot to mention is you will need to leave a 2.5 to 3 inch hole on one of the sides for turning out. This is very important. Now, usually when I do this, I save my red pins as a reminder of where to start and stop sewing. So as I go around the edges here and I pin, you'll notice that when I get to the right side, I will show you a red pin where I'm going to stop, and then another red pin where I will start again, and that will account for that hole that I need to leave for turning. There's the red pin. I'm going to stop sewing there. And here's the other red pin. And I'll leave about 2.5 inches distance between the two. And that's where I know to start sewing again. So that will leave a small hole in the side. You want that hole to be in the middle towards the top end, not too far to the top and not too far down at the bottom either. Now that your bag and your lining are pinned, let's sew the bag section first. This one will have loops at the bottom, and you'll definitely hear when I get to that bottom edge. You'll be hearing that bulk of the loop in the side. But you should have already done this project before, so this is no surprise. It'll just be sort of a reminder. It wasn't that long ago that you were still learning to bury the needle, lift the presser foot, turn the fabric so that you could turn the corner. And every time you sew a project, you're going to have more opportunity to reinforce those foundational skills. And that's going to be the case from here on out. Every single video, every single new skill that you learn, every new concept will build, and you'll have an opportunity to practice each of those skills so that you can become a better sewist. So let's practice those skills again, sewing the lining. Now remember, on this lining piece, you're going to stop at the first red pin and start again at the second red pin. After reaching the first red pin, clip your ends and start again at the second red pin, creating a hole. That hole is very important for turning, so don't forget it. But if you do, there's actually a way that you can make a hole yourself using your seam ripper, and I'll show you that a little bit later. You will want to tack the top and bottom of that hole so that it won't rip out, but I'll show you how to do that a little bit later as well. I mean, honestly, that's one of the nicest things about sewing. Even though it can be incredibly frustrating to pick something out, it also means that you never have to throw something away, that there's always something you can do to fix it. You may have noticed that when I sewed this drawstring backpack, I did not leave the holes in the top like I did before. And that's because I'm going to show you a different way of doing this if you prefer, and that involves our little seam ripper here. But actually I sewed kind of wonky there for a second, so I'm going to show you the seam ripper on this weird stitch that I stitched over, and now I need to remove the first line of stitching. What? Am I admitting I made a mistake? Yes, I am admitting I made a mistake. Now get me that seam ripper. I make mistakes all the time, and that is why I love seam rippers. I have several. I name them. They're my friends. So let's show you how to use this guy. Super, super amazing tool. We definitely need to use this seam ripper on this little seam. So what I did was sew too close to the edge. I need to take out that first line of stitching. So first I'm going to poke that seam ripper underneath one of the stitches. I have to find one stitch, and then I push it all the way through to cut that stitch. There's a little blade on the inside of the seam ripper that will cut the stitch. And I'll do another one or two of them. Afterwards, you can actually kind of pull those two apart in the seam, and it makes it a little easier to find the stitches. So now I'm finding each stitch along the way, poking underneath and pushing it all the way through. Now you have to be very careful when you're poking and pushing. You don't want to poke or push the fabric because you can just as easily damage or cut the fabric as you can the stitch. So you're trying to find that very small stitch and only the stitch, not the fabric, and then push it all the way through. It's just as easy as that, but seam rippers can just as easily damage fabric, so you do have to be very careful with them. Push it underneath all the way through, and then sometimes you can open out the seam and pick it that way as well if you're having trouble seeing the stitch the other way. I find that this is a little faster. Doing it this direction, I can get underneath the stitch and kind of pull, and as I'm pulling, I'm exposing some of those stitches in the seam. Here's another seam I had to pick out, and the stitches are a little lighter, so you can easily see how my pulling is exposing some of those stitches and making it easy for me to only be pushing through the stitches and not the fabric. Talk to me about how many projects I've ruined by accidentally pushing through the fabric and ripping the fabric in a place I could not repair it. Oh, that is tragic. You do not want that to happen to you. Be so careful with your seam ripper. Only rip the stitches, not the fabric. So now you should have your front section that you've sewn with the top open, the bottom and the loops and all of that. And, you know, pressed out those seam allowances. You should have that, as well as a lining section. But the lining section and those seams need to be pressed out. The top is left open, the bottom, but there's no loops in this one. And there should be a hole in that one spot along the side, which is super important. You must have a hole somewhere in there for turning out. And I like to put mine closer to the bottom on one side. That's my preference. But yeah, that hole, super important. And here comes the tricky part. You are going to be sewing these right sides together. So that means let's right side out this section. So turn that right side out. And then this one is going to be left wrong side. And we're going to put this one inside of this one. And that's how we're going to sew it. I'm going to show you. So put this bag inside, match the corners. So there's one corner, match this other corner. And then we're going to match all along the top edge and we're going to pin. So see, I've got these two seams, two side seams, and I'm going to bring them together so that they are lined up, matched on either side. Let's pin. One of the easiest ways to see that you have sewn right sides together is that the seams will be facing each other and you can see that pressed open seam on either side and they should be joining. When you're pinning around this outside edge, I like to start at the seam. It's very important to match that seam and so that both seams are meeting at the same place, which is why I will usually pin on both sides of that seam, even if I've pressed it out, and then pin around the rest of the edge of that top of the bag. Now, hopefully it will match all the way around and you won't have gaps or bulk. There's a possibility that could happen, and if it does, then you'll need to adjust your seam and maybe pick out, like I showed you I did. And that was actually the reason I had to pick that out, because it was too small and my lining and my bag piece didn't match up when I went to pin it like this. But hopefully you won't have that happen and they will match exactly all the way around. Now that you have it pinned and right sides are together with the seams matched on either side, we're going to sew all the way around. I like to start at the seam, and we're going to make this about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Actually, as I'm watching the playback of this, I'm realizing that I should have removed the free arm, but obviously you can do it without removing the free arm. I'm just realizing this would have been a much easier process if I would have removed the free arm, so you may want to do that. Now you're gonna see why you left the hole in the side of the lining. This is the cool part. Find that hole. This is for turning out. So here's the hole that I left. Hopefully it was a couple inches or so, because if it was too small, this is gonna be hard. But you take the hole and then you find the front piece and you pull it through. So there's my front piece and I'm gonna pull it through the hole. And you just keep pulling and keep pulling until it's all the way out. Okay, let's do this. Have to be a little bit careful. You don't want to go too fast. Once you get one corner, it makes it a little easier. Eventually you'll have something that looks like this, and then you're going to want to take this part and put it inside, match corners till you have this cool lined backpack. Take a look, there's your lining, you just sewed it. And notice inside, because it's lined, this is what you see. Not those, you know, open frayed edges or anything like that. So it's a really clean look. I love lining. Now you need to go iron this thing to get it ready for the casing. So by the time you put, you know, the corners together inside and you match everything up, there should be about an inch and a quarter here at the top, but you'll want to get your sewing gauge and make sure that you go all the way around to make sure that it's about an inch from the lining to the top, and then press that all the way around. Actually, I think my sewing gauge was more like an inch and a quarter, but it doesn't really matter. You could be up to an inch and a half on this project. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you use your sewing gauge so you can keep that line consistent all the way around. And I know of no better way to check and to make sure that it's, you know, equal all the way around than using a sewing gauge. They're really, really helpful. Now we're going to sew the casing. It may be easier for you to turn it inside out this way so that you can sew along the edge right here, right next to the lining. Along that edge, all the way around. But me personally, I have got to change my thread because I have green thread. That's not going to look great on this gray backpack. Choosing the right color thread to match your fabric can be very important if you don't want your seams to show. In this photo, it's obvious which thread shows up and which one is more invisible. But usually, if there's ever a question, the rule of thumb is to go with a lighter thread. However, in this particular instance, the darker thread is obviously the one that is more invisible. You're about to learn a new sewing skill called Stitch in the Ditch. It's actually not that complex. It just means that you're going to sew inside the seam line, or as close to inside the seam line as you can get. This time, I'm remembering to remove the free arm. This will make the process so much easier. All you need to do to stitch in the ditch is line up your fabric piece with the ditch, bury your needle inside the ditch, put your presser foot down, and it should look like this. If it does, you're ready to sew. Now don't get me wrong, stitching in the ditch can be kind of tricky. It's definitely something you have to practice, but this project is really perfect for practicing and learning this skill, because if you don't get it perfect, it's not going to maim or ruin the project. But as you practice it, and you can practice trying to get right in the seam line, you can actually make that stitching completely invisible on that side. On the other side, only choosing the right thread will kind of make it invisible, but your stitching line still will show. But by stitching in the ditch, you really can hide your stitching entirely. As you can see in this picture, my stitching is basically invisible where I stitched in the ditch, as compared to the stitching line that you can see on the other side. Now that you've finished sewing the casing of this drawstring backpack, there's only a couple things left to do. And the first is to close up this little turning out hole that you left. Now we need to stitch it shut and to add your drawstring. Now, you might remember that there's no hole to add this drawstring, but we're gonna do kind of a fun little trick with your seam ripper. First, we need to tack the top and bottom, which is actually not such a bad idea to do anytime you're putting casing in, because that drawstring is going to put stress on this seam and this top seam as well. So they need to have a little tack, and I'll show you how to do that. If you look closely in this picture, you can see the stitching line going across the seam on the top and bottom. That's a tack. And all you really need to do to make that happen is to go across the seam, up and down, very close to the edge, several times with your reverse stitch, maybe 2-3 centimeters on either side of the seam on the top, and then repeat the process next to the casing, just on the other side of the stitch that you made in the ditch. 2 centimeters is probably bare minimum, but 5 or 10 is fine. It's not an exact science. Now you're going to repeat the process, starting about 3 centimeters before the seam line on one side and sewing to about 3 centimeters on the other side of that seam line, using your reverse stitch to go back and forth across that area a few times. It's not an exact science. You're just trying to reinforce that area, give it more stability. Let's finish off that hole in your lining by hand. This hand stitch is yet another technique to make your stitching look practically invisible, and if performed correctly, should make it look as if your seam were sewn by a machine. First, thread a hand needle with matching color thread. And then tie a knot in the end. Sometimes I'll make 2 knots on top of each other just to make it a little more secure. Notice there's seam allowance left on either side of the hole. You're going to be sewing in this seam allowance. There's sort of a little channel that you can see right there. You are going to stick your needle in that channel and follow it along the channel edge this way, and then poke it through the top. But what happens next is the important part. After you've poked it through the top, poke it through the other side, but at the very edge. So not too far down, at the very edge of that other side. Let's watch it again. Follow the channel, poke it through, and catch it on the other side. Now pull the needle all the way through, and that's your stitch. Now bring that needle back right across from the stitch that you just made. And follow the channel once again and pull through. Then start another stitch right across from where you just pulled through. Follow the channel, poke through the other side, and there's a stitch. Come down right next to where that stitch was, follow the channel, and pull through. Be careful that your stitches are not too long. I wouldn't make them, more than 5 centimeters long or so. If you make them much longer, then it probably won't be secure. For your last stitch, rather than pulling it all the way through, pull halfway through and then put your needle underneath the loop to make a knot in the loop. And then take one more stitch and go underneath the loop once again to knot it off so you can finish it and clip the ends. Now you're going to need to make a couple of holes in that casing so that you can thread your drawstring. We already made tacks at the top and bottom of that seam to make it very strong so that when you're pulling the drawstring through, it doesn't rip out, either on this side or up top. So you're gonna take this handy dandy, amazing seam ripper that is gonna save you so many times. And you're gonna do what I showed you to do before and very carefully find that stitch. Find a stitch and then we're gonna open it up. Actually, it only usually takes one, and then you just kind of pull it and you'll see that it opens right up. Just a little bit, poke that thing down, look for the stitch and pull. Before you start unpicking, let me be clear about where you're unpicking. You are unpicking between the 2 tacks that you just sewed on the front side of the casing, not the back side, just the front side in between the 2 tacks. So when you get to the tack, stop. And when you get to the tack on the bottom, stop. When you've unpicked your casing seam line on both sides, it's time to thread your drawstring. Use a safety pin to thread the drawstring through the hole that you just created in your casing. When you come to the first hole, pass it and continue threading your drawstring through the rest of the casing. You want your drawstring to come out in the same location you started threading. Now find the hole on the other side and thread all the way around until the drawstring meets itself on the other side where you began. This part can be a little bit difficult because you already have one drawstring in there, and so it makes that casing a little bulkier the second time around, but just persist and you'll get it. Once that's complete, thread both of the drawstrings through the loops at the bottom of the backpack to create the backpack straps. Make sure to knot them. And there's your drawstring backpack. And it is lined, which makes it that much sturdier, that much more professional looking. Oh, lining is the best. And you know, this particular one we did so that the front piece was creating the casing, so that the front piece goes over and, you know, creates that casing, but you can actually do it the opposite way, which I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. The way that we did this one to create the casing going this direction is by making sure that the lining piece was shorter than the front piece. But you can do it the other way and make sure that the front piece is shorter than the lining if you want this lining to go the other way. And let me show you what that looks like. Here's the way the bag looks, the way that we just completed it, with the lining on the inside and the outside part creating the casing. But you can do it the other way, and it looks like this, with the lining creating the casing on the outside. You know, just for fun, let's go through that whole process again so I can show you what it's like if the lining is creating the casing. And let's use that stretchy faux leather stuff that I don't want you to sew on, but I already have it ready and available, so let's get going. To finish this bag, simply unpick the casing seams on the sides to thread your drawstring through, then thread the drawstring through the loops on the bottom to create straps, and don't forget the knots. And then, just like that, ta-da! You have sewn your first ever lined drawstring backpack, you amazing sewist you. And we're done. Except here's a quick PSA about our next project, which will be napkin rings. I do think that these napkin rings that I'm going to show you for the next video are going to be super important for all of you, because we're going to be talking about interfacing and the types of interfacing and how it works and what interfacings are available, which ones work for which projects and why. So I'm really looking forward to that one. That will be coming up as sort of like, I don't know, like a bonus project or something. But I'll just throw that one in next. And I'm looking forward to all the projects that we're gonna do this summer. It's gonna be fun. I have my eye on a few, probably an apron, maybe a chapstick holder, lanyard, maybe a beach towel backpack. Could be a lot of fun this summer.